raised in the same town my whole life. Where my mother taught me there's love in sacrifice. As we lay each brick to build a home, how do you leave the only place you've ever known? Don't drink the water, there's poison in the well.
Now in Louisiana, on my street, I can count at least 3 to 4 people, and my street is only a mile long, that have either died or suffered from cancer, including myself.
Don't drink the water, there's poison in the well.
My name is Genevieve Butler. I'm a resident of St. James Parish. I knew my great-grandparents, my grandparents, and although I live in what's called St. James Parish inside of the 5th District, which is also now known as St. James, we were originally called Freetown. It's a very rural area, so you had the little pockets, well not pockets, but you had like little neighborhoods. I'm a descendant of slaves. I'm a grandmother, a Christian, a mother, and a Navy veteran. So growing up in St. James, the children I grew up with as a teenager and a child, they were never sick. You know, sometimes you would hear about sickle cell or something like that, but if you fast forward to present day, as industry grows and the air gets worse, the water gets worse, the land has changed dramatically, period. So I find that more children are born having asthma, respiratory illnesses. I met ladies who have had miscarriages. Myself, I was diagnosed with cancer in 2017, November. And then 2 years later, I had a thyroid problem. But those are not things that necessarily run in my family. From a scientific standpoint, my aunt developed breast cancer. Her daughter had breast cancer. But my aunt lives within the 2-mile radius to do Dengue, which I was not aware produce chemicals and pollution that could give you cancer. So nobody else in the family has had, cancer to that extent. As being on active duty from 1982 until 1993, when I would come home, I would just notice subtle changes because I came home almost every year. Okay, and then I would gradually notice that the air didn't smell the same, the trees didn't look like they used to look. And people would say, oh, well, it really hasn't changed. So it was such a gradual thing that people who actually lived in the area every day didn't quite notice it, When barges are ships, are docking and undocking, sometimes you have chemical spills. Well, inside that you have benzene, toluene, all these other chemicals that can damage your respiratory system, your nervous system, your heart, your kidneys, your lungs, you name it. You can on any given day. But at the same time, if you go to a doctor and say, I didn't have this before, I've been living away, I'm living here now, they will not say that because of where you're living, it is a problem for your health. But if you live in a neighborhood, the trees are dying, you look and you see that there's residue on the plants and stuff like that, that should tell you That wasn't there 20 years ago. It wasn't there 30 years ago. So what's the difference?
After the Civil War and the slaves had been emancipated, there were all of these huge plantations that were located along the river. But those plantations were no longer economically viable after they lost the free slave labor. And so they started selling off to those lands, and they had this big tract of lands. Louisiana was actively recruiting large industries. They had, all of these natural resources, and industries figured out that until the Clean Water Act, that they could buy cheap land from these former plantation owners that had to sell off, and they could locate their factories right along the banks of the Mississippi, and they could just discharge their wastewaters and all of their chemicals right into the river. And so it really was a alignment of all of these factors, but that's led us to have the highest density of petrochemical facilities in the northern hemisphere are located between Baton Rouge and New Orleans on about a 5-mile corridor on both sides of the Mississippi River, and that is Cancer Alley. I first heard about Cancer Alley in 1988 or 1989 while I was working at EPA, and folks all across the country were aware that the air toxics and the air pollution in the whole Louisiana River Parishes area was at an unacceptable level. And I guess not surprisingly, since I've been here and I've come to know the politics of Louisiana, it's worse now than it was in 1980.
I received a master's in microbiology and chemistry from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And when I finished my master's, I went to work for Gulf South Research Institute for 14 years. And we did all kind of tox studies, cancer studies. We were the training place for toxicologists because there weren't university programs at that time. I had a quick response project with EPA. And I get a call like on Thursday and say, be in this community and sample their air, their water, their land, their blood, their urine for these chemicals of concern. So Monday morning, I had a crew out with them. We set up everything, started collecting samples. I went back and analyzed the samples that they shipped back and then gave the data to EPA. And in those times, you couldn't get a copy of a report. It was impossible, and there was nothing like electronic copies. And what would happen is they would only give the community the summary, and it would say no excess cancers. And I knew it was different because that was the data that I had developed from the samples showed a whole different perspective. So that's when I decided I had to open my own company and help the community understand what was going on to most specifically reduce their exposure. And still today, those chemicals that cause cancer are being released in huge quantities. And in the last 5 years, we really started looking at air quality and testing air quality and identifying that the cancer-causing agents are being released into the air, and the concentrations on the Fenceline and where the communities live, and even where communities live where they establish little communities or little cities, are all being exposed to excess concentration above the standards for cancer.
There's a massive problem with pollution. There's a massive cumulative pollution impact. So not just one plant, but all these plants together, which is not really something that's regulated the cumulative impact. And the impact is most concentrated in poorer communities and blacker communities, often one and the same. So there are these long-standing neighborhoods. A lot of them have been there since emancipation or earlier, where black families have been situated and have been present for centuries now, and for over 100 years now, but really since in a serious way since the 50s, those areas have been the target of massive industrial development. So we're dealing with widespread problems, but with disproportionate impacts on certain types of communities. But this is a problem that affects Louisiana at large in a really substantial way. Bucket Brigade's work in Cancer Alley goes back to our founding, before our founding really, to 99 and 2000, when we were involved with the buyout and relocation of the diamond community in Norco, which was sandwiched between a shell oil refinery and a shell chemical processing plant. But most recently, our major campaigns in the area have been the Stop Formosa campaign, which we were introduced to through our efforts to stop the Bayou Bridge pipeline, which were ultimately unsuccessful. That was a pipeline from Texas, I believe Houston actually, to St. James. That would carry precursor materials for plastics, certain chemicals, etc. Other campaigns we're involved in the area are the opposition to the Wallace grain elevator by Greenfield, advocating for communities descended from the enslaved as they search for unmarked burial sites and such that are threatened by industrial development. I could list several plans, but the main campaign in Cancer Alley right now is to stop Formosa. But our goal is to have a full moratorium on petrochemical development, because we believe that the area is already saturated with development and with pollution.
My name is Christian Earl Bailey. I'm from LaPlace, Louisiana, and I'm a current graduate student here at LSU in the chemistry program. Memories growing up in LaPlace, Louisiana. So small town, very faith-based. Went to a Catholic school, also public school as well. But on Sundays, you go to the Catholic church and you have everybody in mass wearing Saints jerseys and everything, getting ready for the Saints game and all of that. You have a lot of good food, really good vibes as far as the people, very inviting. We are a very close-knit family in regards to like that area. So if you may not know a person personally, you'll know their family. And one of my best memories growing up in the area is the parade season, right? Mardi Gras time. My dad, he escorted the local high school band, and he used to let us ride with him in his police unit. And we used to throw beads outside of his unit to the crowd as we were in the parade. And I would walk along the parade route and everything. So, and then also a lot of my vivid memories in regards to like seeing a lot of chemical plants, because within the area we have a lot of chemical plants. So we have like Marathon, Shell, Valero, DuPont, and they're heavy in the community in regards to like doing backpack giveaways or sponsoring different social events within the community. And then whenever we would pass the chemical plants at night, they would be lit up with their lights. Cancer Alley holds very true to its name, right? I have an uncle, my dad's younger brother. He actually just won his bout with stage 4 cancer, colon cancer. I have had quite a few family members who have passed away from cancer. You name it, they had it. Colon cancer. My aunt, she had breast cancer. She's a breast cancer survivor. I have I have other family members who also have had health issues besides just cancer. Even myself, like I have asthma, and growing up in that area, playing football for that matter, you know, the falls are hotter, the summers are a whole lot hotter, and you have all of that padding and stuff like that, and it's hard to breathe, right? And like literally, you have a chemical plant right there next to the football field. I know for sure, for example, the Catholic Church, Our Lady of Grace Catholic Church of Reserve, the church that I grew up in, DuPont is right down the street from that church. And now we just got a I forgot what the name of the plant is. Denka. It's a blue logo, but yeah. So they're in the area as well now. So like, you name it, they have it, you know. And looking at my life growing up, from the perspective that I have now, it's just kind of just like, oh my gosh, you know, like that wasn't supposed to be that way. You know, the sky isn't supposed to be this certain color, or you know, when they have the stacks at the plant, you have all of this smoke, and you're smelling gasoline, or you're smelling this kind of foul odor in the air. Like you know, that's not normal.
So we looked at how cancer risk from toxic air pollution relates to actual cancer cases in communities across Louisiana, because we've heard for a long time from residents who live in industrialized areas that their firsthand experience indicates that there's higher rates of health problems, including cancer. And despite all the media attention that this issue has gotten, nobody has ever actually looked in a systematic way at cancer numbers relative to cancer risk from air pollution across the state of Louisiana. We found that among communities that have high poverty rates, those that have more pollution have higher cancer risks. So when you look specifically at vulnerable communities, those that have higher than average poverty or higher than average proportions of Black residents, more pollution is associated with higher cancer rates. And it's a very, very clear pattern. And it's not something, frankly, that should be surprising, because these pollutants are known to cause cancer. And that's why EPA classifies them as carcinogenic, and that's why EPA estimates the cancer risk associated with exposure to those air pollutants.
So there was no air toxics program in 1989. The air toxics program was born in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. And Louisiana, and especially at that time, still does not have an ozone problem. And that's what most of the air pollution attention was focused on at the time. And I would say the historical lack of focus on air pollution in Louisiana from a regulatory perspective has certainly contributed to Louisiana getting late in the game in terms of understanding the risk and implementing the appropriate controls. Based on my experience, and I've lived in multiple states and I've worked in multiple EPA regions and offices, I can tell you that the monitoring that's done here is also the least amount of monitoring. And part of that for particulate matter is because Louisiana hasn't violated the national standard and for particulate matter and been declared a non-attainment area. The standard, which is 12 micrograms per cubic meter, which is WHO is now recommending 5 micrograms per cubic meter, so less than half of what the current standard is. Louisiana bounces just underneath that 12 and 11. So EPA has announced that they are going to revisit that standard, which means they definitely will be lowering that standard. And when they do, that kicks in all kind of new requirements and new regulations. But one of those will be monitors, and I think we'll know a whole lot more. It's like so you know. People always laugh about New Jersey having so many Superfund sites. The reason New Jersey has they think this is New Jersey's a terrible place to be, right? But it's because the New Jersey Environmental Agency went looking for them and found them when they went looking for them. If you don't look for them, you don't find them. And Texas and Louisiana are two of the states that are notoriously could be walking across one every single day on the way to work. They should not go looking for them. So.
Many of these industries represent the larger taxpayers in district. They get substantial tax breaks that result in in municipalities getting very little tax revenue from these places, but that's a whole different story. Point is, even so, they represent a large portion of tax bases in certain parishes. They represent the wealthier employers. So a lot of the more influential people in the community may come out of working at those plants, which leads to political influence, right? And that's a self-reinforcing kind of cycle, because once you get economic influence from hiring a lot of the locals, you get political influence. That political influence leads to further economic influence as those companies may say make political contributions, et cetera, which are very unrestricted in this state. So it's a cycle, self-reinforcing cycle of political and economic back scratching, more or less.
One of the things that we've heard for 30 years here, Greg, is this whole idea of Louisiana's, quote, cancer alley. The LCA, along with the Louisiana Tumor Registry, LSU, a lot of different places, put a lot of time and effort into studying the actual facts around cancer in Louisiana. And the truth of the matter is, the highest cancer rates in our state are in northeast Louisiana, where there is very little industry or no industry. Some of the healthiest people we find are folks who work directly in chemical plants. Talk just briefly about the myth of Cancer Alley.
Well, I think it is a myth. I think people look at it and say, well, it must be something wrong. It's got to be something wrong. But the numbers don't bear that out. And so you have to follow the science, and you talk to the experts. Let them tell you what it is.
Oh yes, yeah, that was after Joe Biden announced his climate and environmental justice strategy right early on, and Senator Cassidy, within 2 or 3 days, called a press conference, and he spoke, and the president of the Louisiana Chemical Association also spoke. And they kind of did a tag team to make sure that they got all the messages out. But of course, Senator Cassidy spoke as a doctor and spoke as did the remarks about all of the cancers in Cancer Alley being caused by lifestyle habits. To have our elected senator repeat those lies using his credibility as a physician in the face of everything that we knew, it was I was incensed. And during that press conference, in my talking points, I called him out for repeating that disinformation.
Our clinic represents clients from communities in Louisiana that are seeking to limit the amount of pollution in their environment. And consistently, what we hear from state decision makers is a claim, suggesting that there's a lack of evidence to support the community's health concerns. And a lack of evidence can come from a lack of a problem, but it can also come from a lack of research.
Smoking and diet, that's what they always blame it on. But when you look at the data, and there needs to be much more data, but when you look at the ambient concentrations that DEQ has, and then you look at some of these Fenceline things like I just showed you, you can see that the areas that have the highest concentrations have the highest concentrations of cancer. Right now, we have 2 facilities being proposed that the community does not want there. One of them is Formosa in St. James, and the other one is a grain elevator on the border of, it's more in St. John the Baptist Parish. And those are the 2 that the community has engaged a lot of the national environmental groups to submit comments. And we've had a public hearing on the air permit on the Formosa facility. We did not get involved until after the air permit for the grain elevator was issued. It was a minor source, so when you have a minor air source, you don't have to have a public notice. You don't have to let the community know what's going on. If they happen to be watching for that facility, they'll know. But it's not like there's going to be something in the paper that's going to be this big that you can see as an ad. So those are the 2 proposed facilities right now. And they've taken them to court on a lot of different aspects, like whether or not it meets Corps of Engineer requirements, DEQ. And then we have all the ones that are operating. So in 2016, chloroprene became an issue. And that's when Dinka, St. John the Baptist Parish. And that's when I started working more actively with them. I had been working on the DuPont Dinka facility for many decades, but that was when we really needed to come to the community. And I was doing workshops every 2 weeks. There was that much new data that they had to have. Yeah. So like Dinka is the largest emitter of chloroprene. But the vinyl chloride facilities release like 3 or 4 pounds. So they just try and dismiss those. But when you add it to the vinyl chloride being released and the toxicity, the cumulative impacts. And that's the issue, is everything is based on one chemical, one standard. And the cumulative impact is hard to deal with, hard to assess. The first thing I had to do when I was added to the NEJAC Council was do a report on cumulative risk. And it was very difficult then to say, how can we calculate the community? Can we add up? No, it's more than adding up.
So the tumor registry in and of itself is just rates of cancer without any respect to any risk factors, right? But if you look at that 5 mile on both sides of 10 miles total corridor, it cuts through 12 parishes. And some of those parishes are very sparsely populated. And then you have Orleans Parish, right? And Plaquemines Parish, which are pretty densely, especially Orleans, populated. So what they did was they took the 12 parishes. Oh, second of all, that buffer, right, is where most of the exposure happens. Just 5 miles on either side, not across the entire parish, right? And so Now, some, if the wind's blowing predominantly in a particular direction, you're going to have some of the census tracts outside that 5-0. But most of the exposure is happening very locally there. And so, but let's take Ascension Parish, which the river doesn't even cut through it. It's just a little piece of that buffer. They included the entire population of Ascension Parish who wasn't exposed to any of the missions in Kitchen. So on top of that, so that's solution by dilution, right? Dilute the population and mix in exposed and not exposed. But worse than that, they omitted the most densely populated parishes from their definition of Cancer Alley, and they included those in the comparison. So, I mean, those are gimmicks.
So when COVID first emerged, there was a lack of evidence about the health effects of COVID simply because it was new and hadn't been studied. And so even though this problem is not new, it hasn't been studied to the extent that it should be. So we wanted to address that knowledge gap and determine whether the firsthand experiences of people who live in these industrialized communities are evident in the data that the state tumor registry collects. And in fact, those concerns are supported by tumor registry data. I think that most people understand that there is an environmental health problem in the area known as Cancer Alley. And I think most people, when you drive through this area, it's pretty intuitive to understand why breathing pollution is a problem, right? So we can drive ourselves through this area and our nose will burn, our eyes will water, we might get a headache, and so we can go experience those, very short-term health effects in a very direct way. But in terms of the longer-term health effects, that's where it's challenging to convince state decision makers to take those concerns seriously because there's a lack of research and a lack of data. But I think something that is important is to start with, how do we define Cancer Alley? Because when you don't have an established definition, it's easy for people to say that it doesn't exist. And it seems like, people suggest that if Cancer Alley is real, you would see uniformly high cancer rates in every neighborhood across this entire area. And that's obviously not realistic, right? I live in New Orleans. I don't live next to a giant industrial steel manufacturing plant, right? Like, you can live in the same parish and be breathing very, very different amounts of pollutants. So if we want to address, if we want to look for evidence of a relationship between pollution and health problems, we need to measure both pollution and health problems. And we also need to recognize that the other factors that affect cancer cases and cancer development are going to vary across Cancer Alley. The most important thing to know is that there is unrefutable evidence that Cancer Alley exists, and that the evidence comes from an EPA database that is ultimately based on self-reported industry data. So, you can imagine that that's going to be a pretty conservative estimate of the pollution that's emitted. And even based on what industry is telling EPA, it's clear that the people who live in Louisiana between Baton Rouge and New Orleans face higher risks of cancer from air pollution than the vast majority of US residents.
I could remember boil water advisories growing up, like in elementary school. You get what I'm saying? Like, we'll get the alert on the television in the middle of us watching like a program of the news, and it'll go, ooh, the state of Louisiana or something like that issues a boil water advisory for St. John, St. James, a different parish, or Orleans Parish, or St. Charles Parish. You get what I'm saying? And it's just like, oh, well, I guess we gotta. Y'all don't wash our hands. Mama, we gonna take a pot of water, put it on the stove, boil it, and put it in the bath water and just let it sit in the tub overnight so we can wash our hands, or we'll boil some water and just keep filling up the tub to be able to take a bath. Or like we might put like a little cap of bleach in the water in the tub, like to take a bath. You get what I'm saying? Like who the hell is I'm not trying to take any more bleach baths,
Everybody buys water to drink. My grandson was young. I bought water to give him a bath. I encouraged my daughter to move away. And in my family on that property, there's always been at least 2 to 3 generations living at one time. So that's you might say a breaking off tradition, that he didn't have the same experiences that I had, that my daughter had. Because although I was on active duty, I would bring her back home so she could learn what my family believed and what we could do. But if you're constantly being told that it's not going to impact you, and if you want to believe your representative without reading into it or looking to see what is causing this, and I know out of my 9 siblings, nobody had cancer, nobody had respiratory problems, I have sensitive skin. But outside of that, everybody was healthy. So when my neighbors up the street are telling me their children, they're coughing all the time, they have ear infections, or their wife lost a baby, or so-and-so has cancer, or so-and-so has this problem, then it's an issue.
Even the most compelling study cannot be used to dismiss the firsthand experience of people, right? So we hear from our clients regularly, hey, my mother died of cancer, my sister, in her 40s died of cancer, my son has asthma, all my cousins are dying. We hear a lot of firsthand experiences that don't get the consideration that they deserve from local and state and federal decision makers. And so we need to find a way to value those lived experiences and to incorporate them in environmental decision making.
So the people who don't understand the severity of what's going on in my backyard, take your view of your way of life and look at the things that you take for granted, right? Like being able to go to the faucet and get a drink of water. Like I never thought I would be able to go to a faucet where I'm washing my hands, fill up a glass and drink the water. Or walking outside and literally seeing the sky for what it really is supposed to be, instead of like seeing different colors in the sky, which is caused by the pollutants of the air.
I think if you spoke to community members in Louisiana who are dealing with environmental justice issues, the most consistent frustration that you would hear would be frustration with the State Department of Environmental Quality. Because we consistently hear from our clients that it's difficult for them to get access to the LDEQ. It's difficult for them to get meetings, to have their concerns heard, to have their questions answered. And we also consistently hear that LDEQ does not take environmental justice issues seriously in their permitting decisions. So for example, even though LDEQ is required to consider environmental justice when it makes permitting decisions, it doesn't even have an established method for an environmental justice analysis. And when you don't have an established method for something, you can make it up as you go along, and you can do it differently each time, and you can, try to let your conclusion dictate your process. So it's really important, I think, that environmental justice is taken seriously, not only by the EPA, but also at the state level in Louisiana. So we definitely see that businesses have more access to DEQ than communities do, right? So we regularly see, facilities get, meetings with high-level DEQ folks or with permit writers or decision makers. And regular people do not have that same access. It is very, very difficult for a community group to get a meeting with LDEQ. And at the same time, we know that there's high turnover within that agency, and we know that a lot of people who staff DEQ either come from industry and or leave to go to industry. And while there's not a problem with with that inherently, right? Like if your role is to permit industrial facilities, it can be helpful to have people who understand how industry works. But when decisions are consistently made that favor industry over communities, then it's clear that something's wrong, and that changes need to be made to make sure that communities have the level of protection that they deserve.
I can't speak to anyone's intentions at LDEQ. I don't know them personally. I don't know what they're about. I don't know what their priorities are. What I do know is, even if they did want to do their job better than anyone else in the whole world, they don't have the money and they don't have the staff. And part of that's on the legislature and our political officials. I'll say every time that we've been to the legislature and said maybe we should give LDEQ more money, the higher ups at LDEQ come to the legislature and say, oh no, we don't need any more money, don't worry about it. And of course, there comes the question of where do you get that money? That's a whole different issue. Very politically charged one, of course. But then when we go to the legislature and ask DEQ to do something that they aren't already doing, they say, oh, we don't have the money for it. So there's certainly something going on higher up at DEQ that's causing major dysfunction. That if there are, regular inspectors that want to do their job right, they're overworked, there's not enough money, they couldn't do it. And part of that has to do with political motivations of the people in charge of LDEQ and the people in charge of LDEQ's money. Like I said a minute ago, philosophically, in my experience, LDEQ's priority is not protecting residents from pollution. They see it as protecting industry from regulation, or at least helping industry deal with regulation so that they can do what it is that they want to do. There's a lot of good reason to believe that whenever DEQ does fine someone for massive violations, it's in industry terms a very small amount of money. We're talking about multi-billion-dollar companies getting charged less than $100,000 for dumping the gaseous equivalent of battery acid into the air for years. So nothing, a drop in the bucket to their bottom line, and that money doesn't do anything to help the community that was dealing with that. So regardless of individuals within LDEQ's intention, with individuals who work at LDEQ, regardless of their intentions, LDEQ comes up short, substantially short.
After being called fearmongers and liars, that there's hard feelings of, those are tax-paying residents, and it is the directors, Chuck Carr Brown's sworn duty to protect those residents. And so their hard feelings is certainly understandable.
Data about environmental health issues is a major gap. And so what I mean specifically is air monitoring data, and then also tracking health outcomes. So for example, we don't have a statewide database for asthma. There is no way to look at asthma data to see if people in Cancer Alley have higher asthma rates, because that kind of data is not publicly available. And similarly, even though the state DEQ has about 20 different air monitoring stations throughout the state, not all of them measure the same pollutants. And even when they do, many of them don't operate continuously. And even if they measure a long list of pollutants and operate continuously, many of them are not in the most industrialized areas. So we need air monitoring that measures the right pollutants in the right places across the right time frames. And we definitely don't have that in Louisiana.
The industry is very powerful here, and one of the main reasons is because Louisiana offers the most lucrative tax exemptions for, and it's called the Industrial Tax Exemption Program, ITEP, and it is targeted at big industry. And Marathon, which is oil refinery, which is the 5th largest oil refinery in the state, and one of the largest emitters of fine particulate matter in the state, and certainly one of the largest in St. Pat. I think it's the largest in St. John. Over a 10-year time, was awarded $10 billion in tax exemption, and that $10 billion came out of the budget of law enforcement, public health, education, all of those services that you would expect a local government to have.
There's so much industry in the 5th district, and it's just growing. So in my community, you don't have a gas station, a food store, clothing store, a post office anymore, or a high school. I've attended meetings, and you always get that same look, like, oh no, this is going to be great. You know, we're going to have these $75,000 jobs. They're going to be adding taxes and things like this. But nobody talks really about the ITEP program, which is a tax exempt program for industry that comes in. And for one industry in particular, they had a heavy crude oil fire that destroyed part of their facility. So they came back and they asked for a 10-year exemption. And they got it. Can you imagine what $10 million can do for a school system or for a teacher or for salary? The other thing with the 5th district is, even though plants may pay money into, or taxes or whatever it is, into the environment, to the government, you won't see improvements in our neighborhoods. You know, we have the worst park in the whole parish, but there's no community building.
I have a couple cousins that work at the plants, and I actually worked at a plant out here in Baton Rouge. But like I said, Cancer Alley extends from the New Orleans area to Baton Rouge, because all along the Mississippi River you will have your plants, and you have your barges and stuff like that. And whenever I would cross the Mississippi Bridge out in the area, I would see like the chemical plants just lined up along the Mississippi River. It's kind of night and day, right? So you have your chemical plants in the area that provide opportunity for the community, but there's a glass ceiling for that type of opportunity, right? The chemical plants, they're there, to conduct business. They provide opportunity for the community as far as some jobs working at the plant, like as an operator or as a driver or something like that, or like some janitorial services or whatever. But in regards to like the sciences, right, the hard sciences, like being a chemist or being a lab researcher or something like that, like I don't remember from my recollection at growing up in the community, there being like chemistry demonstrations for like the elementary students or the high school students, or there being like programs saying, okay, you have like a research scientist or somebody that actually works or conducts research at the plant, and they're engaging within the community as far as STEM, right? And then also, not even just that, in regards to like how the plant affects the way of life in the community, right? So like you have your discoloration of the air, and you have like purples and greens and stuff like that, looking at the sky. Or you may have like a little smog and you have a smell and you're just staying inside the house just because you have a foul smell outside your front door.
It's not a job creator. Specifically the petrochemical industry has been hemorrhaging jobs, not just since Biden got into office, not since Obama got into office, but for a few decades now, with a bit of a spike in 2014 because oil prices went up. But we're quickly realizing that peak oil use and peak oil cost, it's already passed. And the oil and gas industry knows this. In addition to automation, they've been laying off workers, and workers are being laid off more and more and more, even as their profits soar. So, even if we let in more oil and gas companies, even if we drill more, we will not necessarily create more jobs, and we certainly won't create long-lasting jobs. So, if we want permanent jobs for Louisianans, we're going to have to look into other economic sectors, because the petrochemical industry is not providing it, because it's a dying industry. It is on its way out, whether we like it or not. And it would behoove state officials to prepare for it by looking at sectors outside of oil and gas for job creation.
I think there are companies and corporations that try to be good corporate neighbors. But it's kind of like all of industry has kind of shifted that way. You know, when my dad went to work for Lockheed, that was like a honored contract where he was going to give that company, you know, his whole life, and he was going to do the best job that he could, and they were going to take care of him and his family for life. And there's not that kind of loyalty anymore. Everything's about, the industry seems to be what they can do for their stakeholders and the top 1%. And I think environment's just swept along in that, along with everything else that's come along with it.
Almost 75 people injured in this blast. There are 3 people that are still in critical condition, and a young man, 29 years old, was killed.
They divvy up the issues they know, and the big money it's bringing in, and the number of jobs. They'll take that perspective and not want to consider the exposure. And then they'll have an incident where a worker or workers are hurt. And then they start paying attention. They were hurt because there was this being released and it might have ignited a fire, or they were hurt and they went down and couldn't get out of the toxins and they died. So once they have an incident, they start paying closer attention to the real issues of workers. In Louisiana, we have a lot of contract workers. So they're not actually employees of the company where they get their check from the company, but from the consulting company. And they let those consultants, companies that provide labor, do the quote, dirty jobs. So they don't have their employees doing the dirty jobs. And then you'll start seeing an accident and it'll be written up in the paper, and it was a consultant. It was not one of their workers. And then they start blaming, oh, well, the laborer did the wrong thing, as opposed to the instructions to the laborer were not adequate to protect their health. One night, the alarm went on, and my husband went out, and I was looking for my keys. Stupidly, I didn't need the keys. They had broken into my office, and we live right around the corner. And when my husband got here, we always had Cokes and Sprite on top of the refrigerator, and they were leaving with the Sprite. So it was not like they had come in to steal something to go pawn. It was they were doing what someone asked them to just come in and break in. And so I do get a lot of pushback, but all of the data is always correct. One example is I did a lot of work on the Shell facility in Norco, which is just past New Orleans, and they had a new manager, and they report accidental releases to the agency and what chemicals they release and how much and what area it was impacted. And I had the community doing odor and symptom logs. And so then, like once a month, we'd have a meeting and I'd have their odor and symptom logs, and then I'd say, and this is what Shell released. So whenever they wanted, we'd go meet with Shell and I'd present that data and they would tell them what symptoms they had for those events. And there was a new plant manager and he said, honey, I don't know what you're talking about, but my facility that I manage did not do that. And he looked at one of his upper management people and he said, would you review what was data? And he said, I would be glad to, but understand I've reviewed her data before and it's always correct. And it's always based on what Shell submits to the agency. And what it was is under him, people took care of the accidental releases and submitted the reports. And either they didn't send it to him or he had a big stack to go through. And he didn't realize. And so we had a meeting and he said, I have to apologize. I had no idea we were releasing all of those chemicals in such large quantities on events or accidents or upsets. And he said, we're going to do something about it. And as a result, they made some really important changes that helped reduce the community's exposure. So if you don't have the opportunity to present it to them and have them go back and see what's going on, then they just fuss, but then they don't make corrections. But in that case, they made the corrections. And then he moved on and the next manager had the same issues.
Like I said about the folks at LDEQ, I can't speak to any individual, shareholder or CEO's motivations. What I will say is, it's a corporation's only goal. The reason a corporation exists is to make money, is to create massive amounts of profit. And these industrial companies do that through extraction, through pulling pretty hazardous substances out of the ground and using intensive mechanical, chemical processes to process that hazardous substance and to export that substance around the world. And at every stage, it's very dangerous to human health. The only real advantage to anybody is of sticking to fossil fuels is that it's pretty easy to make money off of it. So I would say to a CEO who said, if there were a CEO of a petrochemical company of some kind who were to say to me, oh, I believe in climate change and I believe that injustice has been done to the folks that live in Cancer Alley, but I will continue to be a CEO for a petrochemical company because that's what I do. I would only be able to conclude that the reason they're doing that is because it's convenient from the perspective of making money. I kind of hate to say it, but Occam's razor, the simplest solution is usually the correct one, tells me that the only reason they would be doing this is because of greed. Why else would you be poisoning generations of people in their communities that their ancestors built after being freed from the plantation they were forced to work on, a plantation that is still there, a few blocks away from where their descendants live? Why else would they, risk our coast washing away? Why else would they risk all these things? The money must be more important to them. I mean, I don't know any other way to think of it.
Money makes the world go round. If we're not talking dollars, we're not talking anything, right? And like I said before, being a career politician, what is your real motive? Do you want the money or do you really care? You get what I'm saying? So like, when you have these, I'm talking about multi-billion-dollar companies, like what is a couple million to them to be? And that's it's hard for me to believe that they have nothing going on underneath the table or at these country clubs that they go play golf at all the time. You get what I'm saying? And it's a problem. You know what I mean? Because you have people that are, you know, above, you know, that actually are over these companies, and they feed off of the little guy, right? They feed off of the people of the land who at first didn't realize what these chemical plants would do to the land or do to the way of the environment way back in the early 1900s or late 1800s or whatever the case may be, because the Industrial Revolution was like in the early 1900s. So early 1900s, right? And the offspring of these people, and it's like, oh, my grandparents or my mom and my daddy, they sold their land to these big corporations, and now it's just like, what the heck, you know what I mean? So it's very sad. It's a very sad thing, because for me as a local, I'm sorry, this hit me. I didn't realize that it was going to hit me right now, but for me as a local to go anywhere in America and say, yeah, I'm from Cancer Alley, you know what I'm saying? And they're like, wow, you know, like, and you don't have anything else to like reference besides like something like Mardi Gras or the New Orleans Saints. Like, we're way more than a sports team or a particular sport or set amount of sports, right? Or like the effects of what companies have done to our environment. We're way more than that.
Tulane University students today tried to pressure the university to part ways with Shell. Students protested on campus with signs saying shame and free diamond. They want the university to stop accepting money from the petroleum giant. They blame emissions from Shell's Norco plant for ruining the environment in the diamond community.
We feel that Shell profits are tainted by the destruction of the Norco community, and we don't want any part of it.
The folks in Diamond want Shell to buy their homes. Shell bought 2 of the 4 streets in the Diamond neighborhood. People who live there say emissions from the Shell plant are making them sick. They say Shell should buy all of their homes.
So if you look at what happens when you have a fire, 5th District doesn't have a paid fire department. So in case of a fire, your house is going to burn down. You may lose your life. And in an emergency, usually they block off the road so that emergency vehicles can get in. Now, industry has a fire team. They have the resources to put out supposedly fire on their particular property. And that is great. The only problem is your smoke don't stay on your property. You know, your flames may not stay on your property. So me saying sheltering in place, that's not going to help me any. And like I said, you have to drive at least 15 to 20 minutes just to get out. There's only one road. And living where I live, where my mom and sister live right now, no, this is not a healthy place to be. For me, my solution is to get my family out. Regardless of the fact of how many 100 years we've been here, it's been more than 100. I had one industry tell me, well, we've been here 50 years. I'm like, we've been here 100 plus. So that you have no concern or consideration for the people that are there. And Louisiana Environmental Quality, they don't really do their job. So for me, no, that's not, you're not going to get bought out because your house is damaged, your foundation is cracked. So when I look at your house, I'm going to say, well, you know, the house in the other district didn't have any cracks. You live in a rural area. You don't really have any conveniences. You're so schooled here. Who's going to finance a house in this particular area? Even if you were somebody that wanted to come and buy in. If I was somebody that wanted to sell my house. And then on the buyout, unless you've got a lot of land, nobody's coming to us and saying, would you like to buy out?
The Diamond community, where the goal was to get a buyout from Shell. We did accomplish that, but it's a bit of a bittersweet victory when you get a buyout because it means that that community is going to disappear. These folks are leaving, and the case of Diamond, and in the case of a lot of Black communities that get buyouts, these are, before the buyout, areas with higher rates of Black home ownership than usual. So when they're bought out, they often aren't able to use those funds to buy a home because homes are more expensive in places like Baton Rouge and New Orleans, so they have to go to renting. So you have a situation where people who didn't deal with a major pervasive problem in this country, that is Black families' inability to build wealth, own property, we had a place where that was an exception to that rule, but because of industrial pollution, these folks find themselves in the same situation where it's difficult to build wealth because their equity was poisoned, literally poisoned.
So where do you move? And when you have a relocation, like we relocated Diamond next to Shell, but there wasn't the ability to build the subdivision because there's so much swampland around there, and so that we could move them all together. So if I have to work, my kids come home from school, you as the neighbor will bring them in your house, give them a snack, and get them to do their homework. They take care of each other. If I need to go to the doctor and I don't have a car, you offer to bring me to the doctor. So it's all that social interaction. And when you spread out that community to all different places, they lose all of that social substance. And then they're not quite as happy because they don't have that flexibility they had. And so you never know when you're moving if it's going to be worth it money-wise, but is it going to be worth it lifestyle-wise? And if you get into a situation that's even worse, you may not be able to get out of that situation. So that's the issue of relocation. Some of them have worked really well, but most of them feel they didn't get enough to replace what they had.
It's home. You get what I'm saying? Like, that is your place of peace. I find it a shame that a person like myself really wants to move away from home because of the way of life of home, as far as like living, right? Because I've been to like California where the air is, you know, much more cleaner and nicer compared to this. You get what I'm saying? Like, I literally felt myself able to breathe a whole different way my first time being out in California. It's a shame that I had the desire to move away to even be able to like breathe easier. You know, I mean, as a local, I shouldn't want to leave from home because that's home. Home is where the heart is. So why am I leaving from a place where my heart is supposed to be?
So I think the next step is going to be different for each neighborhood. So we definitely, for example, know that, you know, people who live in St. James Parish are concerned about a large new plastics plant that's been proposed by the company Formosa. And so in that case, you know, the community's goal of stopping that plant is a very direct way that environmental justice could be benefited if they can achieve that goal. At the same time, you know, we have another client in that community who is concerned about violations from an existing facility, a facility called Nucor. And so making sure that Nucor's plant, which produces steel, is operating in a way that protects people's health and complies with the permit, that's also an important environmental justice goal. So I don't think any of those categories are exclusive of one another, and I think that environmental injustice is a very complex, multifaceted problem that needs to be attacked from multiple angles.
It's not going to be an overnight solution. It's not as simple as flipping the switch off on every single plant up and down the river. We can't. That's not how it'll go. The solution is what goes. Different people call it different things. You can call it a just transition, a transition with justice. So that would mean no new development, whatever development that is not yet begun, not yet in operation, should be nixed, completely halted. When it comes to existing facilities, we'd be in much better shape if all the existing regulations were enforced, but even so, we should be a little bit more strict than the current regulations. So getting those plants that are around in line with what they're supposed to be doing. And then thirdly, beginning to retrain petrochemical workers in industries of their choice or for very similar industries. A lot of cases, you don't really need a lot of retraining. Say pipeline work. Pipelines are completely agnostic to what's actually in them. So it's the same job whether it's an oil pipeline or a water pipeline or anything. Offshore wind requires a lot of the same workers as offshore oil rigs. So we're actually in Louisiana very well prepared for transitioning workers to greener, to a greener economy. And then after that, in the long term, is going to come decommissioning. Addressing former industrial sites and environmentally sensitive sites that have been polluted in some way, and cleaning them, dealing with them, and monitoring them effectively so that we can put that land back to productive use for something that doesn't create pollution and any kind of hazardous waste. It's really hard to separate responsibility between state and local government officials, and in some cases federal officials, and the industrial companies themselves, because oftentimes their goals have been the same and they've been working together. But if it's a question of where do we get the money to provide these folks what they're owed for decades of injustice, I'll tell you, these industrial corporations have plenty of it. So if it's a question of who's going to pay for it, it's them. They should.
It's not just Cancer Alley in Louisiana. There are industrial complexes in a lot of states that have this very, very negative impact. In 2000, Reverend Coleman in Louisville, Kentucky, which we call Robert Town, asked me to come up. Everybody's sick and we don't understand what's going on. So I started working with them, and it was an industrial complex very similar to Louisiana. And DuPont was there making chloroprene and making neoprene. And so we worked with the mayor of Louisville and with the EPA, and we were able to accomplish a program that had standards in the air. And as a result, a lot of the facilities had to put on control technologies. But the cancers were already there. The exposure had already occurred. But we were actually able to go around with EPA, with the state agency, and with me and a community member at conferences and tell how we were able to get better standards. Now, I've met with representatives from the White House, and she and I agree that enforcement is always lacking. So we can have the best standards in the world. If they're not enforced, they don't, he says. But there are a lot of areas like Louisville, like Cancer Alley, that are high industrial facilities that have high rates of cancer. But almost every one of them has very poor communities that don't have access to health care. So that's why it doesn't show.
When the Bayou Bridge came in, it was a couple 100,000 people that depended on that particular bayou, which a bayou is just kind of like a tributary from a river. So you had 100,000 people who had lived on that land forever, had to worry about whether or not their water source would be inundated if there was an oil spill. And at one point, they only went to put the pipe less than 6 feet under, which is ridiculous, really. So you do have a lot of people that were former slaves or descendants of slaves in the South, and they managed to be resilient and build themselves a neighborhood, educate their kids, be self-sufficient, grow their own food, and to some extent, might as well say, live off the land. But as industry comes in, that goes away. So for other people, if they do it in my state, they do it in your state. Although the Mississippi River's there are other ways, because in Washington, they were going to build a pipe and just float it down the river. Again, you have to save what you have. You know, you can't die for utilities.
Cancer Alley, to a lot of people who find out about it for the first time, seems like something from the early days of the Industrial Revolution that should have been done away with by now. So a lot of people see it as something that's left over from the past. I really don't see it that way. I see it as a blueprint for the future, for a certain type of person's priorities, a certain industrial profiteers' priorities, and their cronies and government's priorities. Cancer Alley is something that those people want to bring to communities across the country, and it's been easier here in Louisiana for a long time, which is why it's this bad right now. But the things that people in Cancer Alley are dealing with are people elsewhere going to end up dealing with over time. We haven't in the United States meaningfully moved away from fossil fuel dependent industry. We're continuing to develop in that regard, and you're seeing places like Ohio, Pennsylvania that are dealing with that. What's going on in Louisiana requires stuff from around the country. It requires fracking in the Dakotas, fracking in Pennsylvania, pipelines that run through the whole country. So even what's going on right now affects the whole country. But should something happen to Cancer Alley, should it become impossible to ship here because natural disasters become too much of a problem, or something happens to the Mississippi River and it changes course, which is a possibility, a whole new thing to get into. But this is a blueprint for oppressing communities, imposing industrial plants, and gaining massive amounts of profit for large corporations that will be exported to other places. That has in fact gone on around the world for a long time. So this isn't something that we forgot to get rid of. It's something that a certain kind of villainous actor is trying to do more of around the world and around the country, but that they were able to do here first. And if we want to have any hope of solving climate change and building a better future, we have to stop them in their tracks, stop them from expanding that, and reverse course in the places where they've been the most successful, like here in Louisiana.
I decided to first and foremost pursue my my master's in chemistry. Initially it was PhD, but life took a turn. But I decided to initially continue to further on my degree in chemistry, because later on in my life I want to do what others have done for me. And these people that have been able to pretty much grow me as a scientist, they're people outside of my community, outside of my walk of life. So I really want to do something special for my community and say, okay, it's okay to be smart. It's okay to look like how I look as a black man, as a black person for that matter, and to come from this walk of life where all you see is just sports, people cooking, or you have like small businesses in the area, or you have a lot of entertainment based industry within the area, and say, okay, you can be from all of this and still be a scientist, right? And that's what I want to do later on within my career, which you need to have, more experience, more education, and you need to be exposed to different walks of life and how other people have grown their communities, and bring it back home. We are definitely more than what Cancer Alley is. Well, when I say that, I mean the name. You have people like myself who come from the area that played sports all their life from the age of 6 all the way up until when I was 20, turning 21 in college. And majored in chemistry and is looking to, and I am going to have a very successful career in the sciences, whether it be chemistry or any other applicable field of chemistry. And you have a lot of people within the area that have that potential, as far as like the younger generation and everything, and then including like the culture and people of the older generation. You know, you have more seasoned folk from the area that may not know the more complex things of life, but they can tell you all about about the area, or they can tell you all about some given aspect of life, and that shows a lot of potential for a breeding ground of greatness. So I would say, if you have the ability to go into the area and change it for the better, come on, please, because we need you.
You know, when it comes to transitioning from fossil fuels, it's not a question of if, but when. We are going to be forced to sometime if we don't do it voluntarily. And in the case of Cancer Alley, that when is, will we transition when we can still provide for these communities, when these communities are still able to be there? Or are we going to do it when it's too late to save these communities? Are we going to do it in a way that is just to those Fenceline neighbors that live there and the workers who rely on this industry to provide for their families? Are we going to do it when economic necessity deems that these plants just close on their own without any recourse for workers, just leaving them high and dry? I believe that the best approach for everyone involved is to begin transitioning now, to do it quickly. Otherwise, the consequences are going to be far more deleterious to the future of Louisiana and the future of every Louisianan, not just those that live right next to the plants, but every Louisianan, if we don't begin that transition right now.